everyone, and welcome. I see here some unfamiliar faces who are joining us for the first time. I warmly welcome you. The idea tonight is to have a lecture. This is not part of the reading group. It is simply a lecture about a book, which is the Self-Taught Philosopher. It may seem, perhaps, a bit exotic because it is not a very well-known work in our country, but it was a request made by you yourselves. We have the new Acropolis channel on YouTube, where we receive suggestions from our listeners. And when suggestions are very frequent, sometimes we feel inclined to fulfill them. For example, the reading of the Tao Te Ching on Monday was also a request made through YouTube as well. This book, at a certain point, I mentioned in a lecture because I like it a lot, and some people asked me to talk a little about it, especially because, being a work of literature that is somewhat outside our cultural context, it's sometimes subject to certain misunderstandings when read. So, I made myself available to have with you this Friday conversation, so that we can get to know a little, not only about this book, the Self-Taught Philosopher, but also about a very unique world, which is the world of Arab and Hellenic philosophy, from the 8th to the 13th century AD, especially from that region of Andalusia. I will not speak at length about this, but it is important for you to know that in that region there were some remarkable people who had a significant influence on Western philosophy. Because the University of Paris, Albertus Magnus, Thomas Aquinas, everyone was inspired by these individuals. Averroism spread, influenced the Renaissance, and shaped thought throughout history. That is to say, Avempace, Ibn Tufayl, Averroes. We have a group of truly significant names. We will speak specifically about a book, which is the only one that remains, from the work of this master, the master of Averroes, who was Ibn Tufayl. The work he created is a fable, with a very interesting poetic content, especially for those who appreciate philosophy. So, I wanted to share this with you, and I hope it will be worthwhile. Let's go. The Self-Taught Philosopher is not the name of the book. You might be confused, but that is not the title. It was translated this way in the 17th century. I made a note here so I wouldn't forget. In the year 1671, into Latin, by Richard Pocock. I don't know for what reason, but when translating it into Latin, he changed the title, which was Living, Son of the Watcher, to the Self-Taught Philosopher. Perhaps he believed it would have greater appeal, but the two names have nothing to do with each other. It may have greater appeal, but it is also prone to misunderstandings, because it gives the impression that a person alone, starting nothing, could go from complete ignorance to absolute wisdom without relying on the collective human cultural heritage, without any guidance whatsoever. And this is likely to create certain fantasies. But that's not how it works. I assure you that none of you would undergo surgery with a person who taught themselves medicine. Without ever setting foot in a medical school, you would want them to inherit the collective human knowledge in that regard. So, this left the work open to misunderstandings. And we will, in fact, talk about this as well. The Self-Taught Philosopher tells the story of an imaginary character. First of all, I ask you to forgive me for the names, because this is Arabic, from the 11th century. The 11th or 12th century. So, obviously, if there is anyone here who is knowledgeable in medieval Arabic, which is something very common, very frequent, you might find my pronunciations a bit strange, and they probably are. Fortunately, experts in medieval Arabic are rare, so I can commit my barbarisms without much trouble. Hey Ibn Yaksin, which means the title, the living, son of the vigilant, was written by this master, named Ibn Tufayl, a name whose pronunciation was later Latinized, who was practically a thinker, who, if it were not for this work, and for having introduced Averroes into philosophical thought, would have remained anonymous to us. He lived in a particularly fortunate time, because he lived under a caliph, who was a lover of the arts and letters. The Caliph of Morocco, The Almohad, Yusuf II. He was a great promoter of philosophical thought, and this greatly contributed to its development, especially in Spain, the region we call Andalusia, because he was an Andalusian thinker born in Cadiz. He developed a series of disciples and carried out an entire alignment of thought in relation to Greek philosophy. These people were Hellenic. They read Plato, Aristotle, and their contribution to the understanding of Aristotle was something tremendous, having an enormous impact on history. You will notice that, as the years went by, this Hellenic philosophy within Islam disappeared. It existed only during this interval of time. From the 8th century to the 13th century after Christ, it vanished. It has a curious name that we will soon come to know, which is falsafa. Falsafa is the name for philosophy in Arabic. It means philosophy in Arabic. These philosophers, who at first were greatly supported by some caliphs, after a while began to enter into conflict with Islamic religion, with the Kalam, which was theology. This caused the later philosophers not to fare as well as the earlier ones, and gradually they were swallowed up by history. Averroes himself did not fare as well as Ibn Tufayl, for he had a rather troubled life. But they are very interesting. They have very beautiful ideas, and we know practically nothing about them in our current Western world. Well, then, it's impossible to know how accurate, but I personally have looked at some paintings of these philosophers of that era, and they look so similar that I wouldn't be able to tell one from another, so I wouldn't trust those paintings. Even so, this would be a portrait from the era by a painter, referring to Ibn Tufayl. He even became a vizier, that is, a personal secretary to this Caliph Yusuf. A wise caliph, a philosopher caliph, lived between 12th and 13th centuries. These people, my friends, if there is one thing you cannot say about them, they were one thing that no one told them, that they had to be just one thing, because they ignored the specialized prescription. They were everything, something, encyclopedic. They were all like that. Avicenna and Averroes were too. Ibn Tufayl was simply a physician, mathematician, astronomer, philosopher, poet, and something more in his spare time. He was everything. They had an encyclopedic vocation, a universalist spirit, these Arab thinkers. In fact, they had a certain ambition to synthesize knowledge itself truly, because there was nothing they did not get involved in. Once, while passing by a bookstore, I discovered that Leonardo da Vinci was a first-rate cook of top quality. I said, no, that's not possible, at least that. He had to be bad at something, but he wasn't. They say all would flock to his house, more than to see his paintings, to taste food, because he cooked well. It's astonishing, don't you think? I was, personally, a bit offended by this. At least, he could have been a bad cook, so that we might have something in common. But not even that. These great geniuses of history have this vocation, this universalist spirit, and Ibn Tufayl embodied all of this and even more. He was the teacher of Averroes, as noted. And now, the little word I mentioned to you earlier, which is somewhat unfamiliar in usual vocabulary. Falsafa is the word for philosophy in Arabic, and philosophers were called philosophers. Those who practiced falsafa. It's an easy name, and I'm sure you've all memorized it. Memorization is of extraordinary importance. Falsafa was a group of thinkers who were committed to thought and inspired by the Greeks. They did not start from religion to arrive at philosophy, although they sought to reconcile philosophy with Islam. They enjoyed a great deal of freedom, and at a certain point, this led to conflicts, tensions between them and religion. If you notice, within any religious structure, there is mysticism, there is theology, and at some point, there is also a philosophy. And during this brilliant period of the Arab world, we had Sufism, which represented mysticism, Kalam, which was theology, and we had Falsafa, which was philosophy. All three were independent from one another. It's interesting because the philosophers helped to build a bridge between mysticism and religion. They helped, for example, Al-Farabi one who gave us the word Alpharabio, Old Book. I'm not sure why they were inspired by him, perhaps because these were ancient books, but the fact is that he helped to minimize the conflicts between religion and mysticism. So there were these three very well-defined worlds. After some time, theology continued, mysticism continued, but philosophy disappeared from this path. These two worlds became isolated. They lost the bridge between them. Imagine what it must have been like to live in Andalusia during that era. Caliphs who encouraged culture and attracted Jews, Christians, people from various places, and intellectual thought was encouraged. You may have heard of the House of Wisdom. That existed in Baghdad. It was a time of a series of dynasties, of caliphates, that were highly cultured and encouraged knowledge. This took place over a short period, now past, but it left a very interesting legacy. Continuing on. This book, among other things, was one of those that inspired the imagination of Daniel Defoe to write Robinson Crusoe. It is said that he was inspired by this and by a real case of a Scottish sailor, Alexander Selkirk, who actually spent 3 years on an island, 3 years on an isle, abandoned by his ship. And it took 3 years for someone to come by and rescue him. Survived, but no one knows how. No one was on the island. This real-life case of the sailor is quite interesting. I don't know if you saw that. Last year, or at the beginning of this year, they found the island, which is an island off the coast of Chile. And there they discovered the huts, the places where he lived. In other words, they were able to historically confirm the story of Selkirk. Selkirk in this book gave rise to Robinson Crusoe. They were the inspiration for this adventure work, so well known in the West today, which was adapted to films and more. It's an interesting fact. Basically, it's about a man living alone on an island. The self-taught philosopher addresses this theme in a way that is very focused on myth, on the pursuit of knowledge, and not on the quest for survival. So, it has a markedly different emphasis from those that came after. Well, these are just the preliminaries so that we can situate ourselves. And let us begin with the story. So, the name of the book is The Living Son of the Vigilant. There is something important for us to recognize. We will be speaking about Hay. And this Hay is not an ordinary man. At no point did Ibn Tufayl intend to suggest that a man, alone on an island, utterly ignorant, could attain wisdom by himself. He was a very special man who already had within himself a tendency, an inclination toward wisdom. Ibn Tufayl's intention in creating this kind of fable, I think we could call it a fable, was to persuade the thinkers of his time, especially those of a religious orientation, that philosophy is not something that can simply be forbidden. He, personally, had not yet faced political problems with the caliphs. That would come later. But among the tendencies of religious thinkers, in the theology of his time, there was already a certain aversion to philosophy. This business of philosophy questions religious precepts. This business of philosophy creates doubts within religious thought. In other words, there were already difficulties, and the idea was already circulating that the caliph should forbid philosophy. And he wanted to explain to people why this is impossible. How can you forbid philosophy, my friends? If philosophy is an inherent attribute of the human condition, even if you were to forbid this name, erase this name from the history books, how could you prevent a person from being born with an inclination to understand the reason for life, the meaning of life, to seek a truly human direction? How could you prevent the love of wisdom from arising within the human being? There is no law in the universe that can forbid this. And that's what Ibn Tufayl meant to say. Look, no way around it. How are you going to forbid philosophy? Will you forbid nature from producing philosophers? Then forbid nature from producing human beings. Because even if a man, if he has a philosophical nature, were isolated on an island, if this is already awakened within him, it will find a way to overcome obstacles and emerge. Now, nature does not make leaps. This means that no one who is absolutely ignorant, so quickly and without any help, would reach wisdom on their own. He is speaking of a man who already had, philosophy awakened within himself, and who, for whatever reason, found himself in a very adverse circumstance. But even so, he knew how to rise above that circumstance. As you go through the book, you will come to understand this. So, he speaks about Hay and presents two possible origins. Either he was abandoned by his mother, or he arose through spontaneous generation. He was born on the island and nobody knows how. It is a fable. He has the freedom to invent whatever he wishes. Isn't that so? But imagine the most plausible hypothesis. To the south of India, in the ocean, an island, his mother had an illegitimate child. And since for a woman in India, he is speaking of India without even knowing it, as a hypothesis, this was unacceptable. She places the boy in a little basket and sets him adrift in the ocean. Mythology often likes to place babies in baskets. This is a particular detail you should notice, which is interesting. Babies in baskets are everywhere, throughout the four corners of history. This is another example. So off went Hay inside the basket. This one was set adrift in the ocean. Poor thing, it was harder. He went, the basket carried by the waves, until it reached this island. When he arrives on this island, still a baby, he is adopted by a gazelle. There is an aspect of this book that is very interesting because it divides Hay's life into septenaries. Every 7 years, he goes through a different phase of consciousness. Well, this is very characteristic of the Indian tradition to which the book refers. The Indian tradition speaks of the septenaries of life, says we continually revisit experiences and mature with each septenary. In other words, a child up to the age of 7 would revisit experiences related to the physical body, learning to sit, to walk. From 7 to 14 is the emotional phase. From 14 to 21, the mental aspect would be revisited. Why do you think adulthood is set at 21 years old? What an imprecise number. This comes from the Corpus Juris Civilis Romanus, which inherits from the most ancient traditions. In other words, 21 is the third septenary. It is the moment when the mind awakens, because a broken number would not make as much sense. It is the third septenary, and a person up to the 7th septenary, which is at 49 years old, should have had some conscious contact with their own essence and with the essence of the universe, which would be the idea of God. Because if this does not happen from that point on, materialism begins to create resistance, generating inertia. Becomes more difficult, not impossible, but it gets more difficult. Some perception of God should occur by that age. And so, he divides history in this way, in cycles of 7 years. So, Hay as a baby is adopted by this gazelle on an island in the southern hemisphere, below India, and this gazelle raises him, nurses him, and protects him. The truth is, I have absolutely no idea. And I hope you won't ask me this. I don't know how long a gazelle lives. I've really no idea. That's a detail I haven't researched. But the fact is that when he turns 7 years old, the gazelle is already elderly, begins to enter a process of degeneration, and dies. Before he turned 8 years old, that is, as he finished his 7th year of life, he experiences his first great drama. The gazelle dies, and she dies of old age. This is a tremendous shock for him, because for a child raised on an island, surrounded only by animals, and with no contact with any human being, what does death mean? What happened? No one hit her, no one hurt her. No predator attacked her, she simply fell and is intact. Why doesn't she wake up? Why doesn't she walk? What is happening to her? For him, death is the first shock with which he comes into contact. So, he starts to imagine, if I open her up, maybe I will discover what is wrong with her and be able to fix it. Because nothing happened on the outside, the problem must be inside. And he cuts open the gazelle and reaches the heart. There, he finds the 2 chambers of the heart empty. And he says, there should have been something here, inside this heart. That was truly my mother. And that has left because now it is empty. So there is no way for her to return. This is nothing more than a shell. What she was must have been inside this space. And it is gone. And with this conclusion, he leaves the body of the gazelle and continues living alone. This is a first realization that, you must agree, is very perceptive. An essence, a center, once dwelled there and moved on to another plane, and I must discover what that is. And so he remains a 7-year-old child on this island, the second 7-year cycle of his life, until age 14, struggling to survive alone and trying to understand what this essence was that once resided in his mother's heart. One beautiful day, a lightning bolt struck the island of Hay, and this lightning caused a fire. He is left astonished by this. Imagine, this is a man who has had no interaction whatsoever with humans. It may seem very trivial to us, but the wheel, fire, learning how to produce these things, are highly sophisticated inventions. And he is left in awe of the fire. He says, look at how it moves, how alive it is, how it radiates warmth, how it illuminates. My mother, when she was alive, she was full of movement, vitality, and warmth. I would warm myself beside her body, and she would light my way. So, I am certain that within her heart, what existed was this. This must have been the very substance that was inside her heart, and it left with her. This is very interesting because symbolically, fire, with its vertical nature, is associated with the spirit, in the same way that water, with its horizontal flow, is associated with matter. It is the cross of the world, spirit and matter. So, the idea of vertical, luminous fire, always reaching for the heavens, no matter how you turn its base, it is always vertical. Water, no matter how you turn, its container is always horizontal. The intersection of the two is the cross of the world, spirit and matter. In a certain way, he sees fire as a symbol of the spirit. This is universal. Traditions throughout history. Heraclitus spoke about this in Greece. He associated the spirit with fire. He symbolically sees in fire a symbol of that essence he was seeking. I mentioned to you, to those who are participating in our Tao Te Ching group, that Yong, who was very fond of this Chinese tradition, he says the universe is entirely symbolic and that this symbol can be reproduced by another equivalent symbol. So, the association of fire with spirit should not be arbitrary. It must have some real meaning. In human essence, that resembles fire. And this young man, so intuitive and so inclined toward wisdom, perceives this and says he discovered what was inside his mother's heart. It must have been this. This gives him a broader vision, that beings truly have an essence. This essence lives in them, then departs. And this essence lives in them and then leaves them. He continues, and at a certain moment, he needs to hunt, he needs to obtain his own food. As he always has, ever since his mother stopped feeding him, and he begins to make tools, using bones, stones, and other materials he finds there. He starts to carve these minerals and create tools for hunting, for working with the bodies of animals, and so on. And at a certain moment, he looks at all these tools that he has built and that he has used for his own survival. And he says, look, my mother's body and my own body and all the bodies in the universe must be like these tools. There must be a being within us manipulating this tool that is the body, and this being who manipulates the tool must be our essence. It must be a being of fire who uses these tools in order to survive in the world. So the physical body of beings must be just like these tools. Notice that what Ibn Tufayl was trying to do there was to show what a philosophical reflection is, one that is not induced by any school, that is not forced by any external factor. It is innate to the human being. I really appreciate these small reflections because they show and reinforce within us what it means to be a philosopher. Just today, I received a very curious text, a very charming one from someone who said, well, I was writing and suddenly I saw the shadow of my pencil on the paper. And I noticed that when I held the pencil far away, the shadow became huge. It looked like a torpedo. And when I brought it closer, the pencil became clear and very small. I realized that I am somewhat like this with the obstacles in my life. When they are far away, their shadow becomes enormous. It gets distorted and I become afraid of them. But when I get closer, I see it's just a pencil. This person, through this small reflection I read today, made a highly philosophical reflection from the shadow of a pencil on a sheet of paper and understood why they were so afraid of difficulties and found a way to make them less frightening, which is by getting closer. You see, For things like this, you say, well, this is a philosopher. And who could forbid something like this? It is something that belongs to human nature. It is deeply rooted in human nature. It cannot be forbidden, nor can it be forced. It awakens from the moment that a person begins questioning themselves. So, this is a reflection he makes between the first and second septennium. Then the third septennium begins. Hey, living alone on this island, surviving through his hunting, his gathering, in whatever way he can. And at a certain point, he reaches age 21, living in this way, a little Tarzan, so to speak, or a Mowgli, if you prefer. This is present in many stories. At a certain moment, he begins to notice and pay attention to the different forms of beings around him. So, he looks at the stone. He works the stone to make his tools. He looks at the plants, eats some of them. He observes animals of different sizes and types. He feeds on some of them. And at night he looks at the stars. He begins to notice how curious forms are. Forms are like tools that serve someone. But it seems that forms become more refined over time. Because I see that a plant expresses life better than a stone. It seems to be freer, it has more mobility. So, it must be a form that has become more refined. Nature must have been perfecting forms to allow life to express itself more fully. An animal already expresses life better than a plant. It moves, jumps, goes here and there. It has greater freedom to express life, and also becomes more powerful regarding its circumstances. A stone, if you decide to break it, throw it into the sea, it has no way to react except through its hardness. An animal, on the other hand, runs away from you. You have to chase after it. It becomes more autonomous regarding its circumstances. And I can do more than an animal, because I'm shaping my own tools, and they do not know how to do that. I have many ways to hunt them. They do not know how to do that. It seems that my form is a little more refined than that of an animal. It expresses life better. This is something he thought alone. Life, that essence which dwells within bodies, seeks to express itself, and begins to transform the form, to expand the form, to make room as if it were a baby inside its mother's womb. It keeps expanding, developing, making space. And the more the form evolves, the more life is set free. He looks at the stars and says, look at how amazing this is. These stars that keep spinning every night are also forms. They are so bright and so beautiful, and it seems that they do not depend on anything or anyone to be bright and beautiful. They must be the most perfect form that exists, because they are autonomous. They don't need anything from the outside. The stone, the plant, the animal, myself, we all need things from the outside, and they seem to not need anything. They are very perfect. So, these shining things that exist in the sky, what we call planets or stars, must also be forms, and life must have become even freer there. They must be more evolved forms of freer life. You can see that these reflections of his create a chain of life that stretches from a stone to a star. He realizes that life is trying to carve out space, but that everything follows the same logic, and everything must have an essence. He then continues with these reflections. This idea of autonomy, of hardly needing anything from the outside, he says, this must be a level of development. The more autonomous, the more developed. And he draws great inspiration from the observations he makes. Imagine, without knowing, any other human being, without writing, without anything. As I mentioned to you, this is a fable. It's very difficult to imagine. It would have to be a wise person who is simply recalling what he already knew. But Ibn Tufayl says, even if this happens in one lifetime or, for those who believe, in as many lifetimes as may be necessary, this potential exists within the human being. He couldn't speak of many lifetimes because he was within a tradition that did not believe in that. But he says, this potential is within the human being. Continuing, at a certain moment in the 5th septennium, at 35 years old, he will look at things and say, well, plants are born, they die, others are born. Animals are born, they reproduce, they die, others come. Things come and go, come and go. The stars come and go. It seems that there is a being behind all this. Who is moving all these things? And who never ceases? What is the invisible hand that is behind all of this? Pushing these things toward life, renewing these things, because everything disappears and is renewed, disappears and is renewed. This invisible hand, this impulse behind things, never ends, nothing comes to a halt. It is always there, harmonizing and pushing things toward life. In other words, behind the things that pass, there is something that remains. Behind temporary things, there is something eternal. There is a being behind it all. It is as if everything is in his hands. And he is bringing things forth and taking them back. Bring things forth, take them back. Everything passes, but he does not. He remains. The movement is perpetual. Who creates this movement? He begins to suspect, my friends, that behind time and space, there is infinity and there is eternity. It is impossible that there is not a being who remains, who is behind the scenes of life, pushing all of this into existence. There must certainly be something there. And this suspicion grows ever stronger within him. The universe moves endlessly. There must be a being of infinite power, whose potency is not limited to the body. He generates all these bodies, but where is it coming from? The intelligence that created these bodies? Where is this flow of life coming from? That passes through the bodies and never stops. In other words, behind that which dies, there must be something eternal. It would be impossible, logically impossible, for everything to be fleeting. Who would orchestrate this spectacle? What is the force that moves all of this? So, he deduces, through logic, that the infinite and the eternal exist. He is already getting closer. At 35 years old, he is drawing near to God. At a certain point, Arhe continues. He arrives at a conclusion that I find brilliant. You know something, there is certainly eternity behind time. Now, I look at a stone, at a plant, and I see them with my physical eyes. I hear a bird singing with my ears. With which sense do I perceive eternity? Because I am certain that it exists. What within me is feeling this? I experience the taste of food with my sense of taste. So what within me is experiencing eternity? After pondering this deeply, he comes to the conclusion that if he experiences eternity outside, it is because there is something of eternity within him. How amazing is that, right? He comes to perceive an eternal essence within himself, because if he did not have it inside, he would not perceive it outside. That would be impossible. Like attracts like. Similar makes contact with similar. If it were foreign to me, I would not even think about it. So, there is a sense within me that perceives eternity, and it is eternal. There is an eternal essence within me. Well, just as I can approach the stones, the plants, the animals, and, in a certain way, even the stars, can I not also approach this essence? How do I approach other beings? By imitating what they do. I trying to understand their logic. I can approach this essence. I trying to do the same thing, to find this sense within myself, in order to connect it with eternity outside. To find eternity within and connect it outward. So, he begins to concentrate, to discover how he could establish this communication. Through touch, smell, and sight, he communicates with things that are fleeting. But how can he find within himself a sense that would connect him with eternity? He begins to focus on this. He is already almost reaching his 7th septenary. He has moved beyond the 6th septenary. This excerpt is from the book itself. I don't like text on PowerPoint slides. It's not very pedagogical, but it's worth it occasionally to read certain passages. Written by the author himself. See the beauty of this. Once he was certain that the perfection and the pleasure of his own essence consisted solely in the intuitive, perpetual, and ever-active vision of this necessary being, to the point where he would not turn away from him, not even for the blink of an eye, so that should death surprise him in this state, he would attain a pleasure unmixed with any evil. He began to reflect on how he could achieve the continuity of this intuitive vision, so that no interruption could ever occur. To put it more simply, if I fix myself upon what is eternal, I will not die. Now, if death catches me distracted, focused on what is fleeting, I will pass. So, I cannot allow death to catch me distracted. I must remain fixed at all times on that which is eternal. Death cannot take that away. He begins to seek ways to anchor himself in his eternal essence. He starts to observe how beings interact with nature. This too is very beautiful. This is already the 7th septennium. That is, he is approaching 49 years old. He sees the following. He realizes he has something in common with animals, with the stars, and with God. He attends to each need, seeking asceticism, union with God, with increasing frequency. He looks at everything around him and says, well, if my human form frees life more than that of a stone, than that of a plant, than that of an animal, then surely I must do more for nature than all of these beings. And in truth, I am seeking to reach the eternal, so I must even do what the stars do. And he begins to imagine how he could interact with the world by giving the world what is rightfully its due, in order to reach the level of liberating his own consciousness and unite with that which is beyond the world, beyond time, beyond space. So, stones possess inertia, he says. I need to give a bit of inertia to my body. I need to let it rest. Plants have energy. So I also need to give a bit of sunlight, a bit of energy to my body, to exercise it. Animals hunt. They fight for survival. I will also have to hunt, only to the extent that it is necessary for my survival, and no more. I will have to gather plants and nourish myself only as much as is necessary, causing the least possible harm to nature. The stars revolve in the sky, bringing light in cycles. Do you know what he did? I will imitate the stars. He would walk around the entire perimeter of his island, bringing light. What did that mean? Whenever he saw a branch that was blocking the flow of a stream, he would remove it. When he saw an injured animal, he would care for it. He would walk the path observing and reflecting on how he could bring more light to that island, improving everything he encountered. He moved in a circular orbit, imitating the celestial bodies. After he had paid his tribute to all the kingdoms of nature, he'd say, "No, I want God. I have already paid my daily tribute to all the kingdoms that came before me. Now I want God." And he would begin to concentrate in order to find that silence, that emptiness within himself, where all separateness was overcome, where time was transcended, space was transcended. And so, he begins to find this essence within himself, to perceive the characteristics of this essence. So he begins to develop a mystical life, a stage of divine contemplation. And he begins to do this every day. A time for the stone, for the plant, for the animal, for the stars, and a time for God. Each time more frequently and for longer periods. It is said in the beginning he tried to find this idea of non-separateness, of unity, of the eternal, and he had great difficulty. Little by little, through so much persistence, he begins to touch upon it. Imagine a man persisting in something that is merely a hypothesis, an abstraction, and doing so alone without anyone telling him to. He keeps persisting, and gradually manages to establish this state of unity. Every day, he returns to that state, and this is where our dear Hay found himself. Just to reiterate what we have already discussed, he reiterates the necessity of animals, the necessity of the stars, and the necessity of being, which is the pursuit of unity. He discovers this. He focuses himself and every day seeks out all of these necessities. Abstraction from any sense of separateness, a vision of the one God who gives life to everything, and where all beings find their reflection. Then he realizes, if I can achieve this, death can no longer touch me. Death is merely the loss of the shell. What I saw, the body of my mother, was just an empty shell. Her essence cannot die. And if I am able to merge this essence with the eternal essence, then death is gone. I cannot allow death to catch me off guard while I am still identified with my shell. And so he was there, engaged in this practice, when at a certain moment something happened. Something completely beyond his expectations occurred. There was an island at a certain distance, and this island was inhabited. In fact, it even had a kind of village, with a relatively large population. There were people living there. Until then he didn't know this. It was not visible. On this island lived two friends, whose names were Saul and Solomon. Childhood friends, two very clever children, highly intelligent. But Saul had a mystical inclination, while Solomon had a tendency more oriented toward politics, more focused on leading the people. And as they grew up and became young adults, Saul began to become a mystic, a kind of monk, and Solomon became a political leader of that region. Of that village, Solomon grew corrupted. He starts to manipulate, he starts doing things that deeply disappoint his friend, because Saul is unable to awaken him to remember what their intentions were in childhood. He cannot awaken those people and becomes overwhelmed by human beings, alienated, completely uninterested in anything he might have to say. One day Saul says, "You know what? I will give up on human beings. I'll become an ascetic. I'll take a little boat and I'll go to that far island. There's no one there. You'll be the only one." Or so he thought. There was someone there. So he takes a little boat and heads to the island. He arrives and, apparently, there really was no one. It was said that this was an uninhabited island. He settles in and begins to do what is necessary to produce his own food, when, suddenly, Hay was following his own star-like journey, wandering around the island, and he comes across a very strange being. What is this? It looks like me. And he didn't speak any language. No language. Had never seen another human. He becomes very curious. He's a philosopher after all. A philosopher's curiosity is sometimes persistent. He becomes curious to understand what this is about. Saul sees him and says, "A wild man. How will I approach him without him attacking me?" And little by little, they start getting closer, drawing nearer and nearer, until they make contact and Saul begins to teach him the codes of language. And he, with great ease, he quickly picks up the codes of the language until they are able to communicate. Now, this was an incredible surprise for Saul, because when he begins to talk with the man, he sees man knew more. He was a mystic. He was a man who possessed knowledge of the divine Saul never imagined. He became a true master to him. He knew far more than Saul did, and he is left astonished by this. And he begins to share with him the entire path that he had traveled to reach the most intimate understanding of himself. Then a complicated problem arose, which was Saul explaining where he came from and what human beings were like. Because Hay simply could not grasp this idea, no matter what. And he says, "Look, I lived in a community. Hey, really, are there many like us? Saul, there are. Hey, how do they live? They must be eager to find God. No, nobody's thinking that. Hey, what do you mean? How can there not be? At least it must be because you didn't explain it properly." Saul, no, look, hey, not all human beings are the same. Hey, humans are like this. It's in their nature, you just didn't know how to explain it properly. So, Saul begins to explain politics to him, and then religion. Hey, religion, what's that, my friend? Saul, religion is a set of representations. Saul then starts to explain to him, religion is a set of representations of God that are created. Hay says, what? Representations of God? I am trying to remove the man, break out of its shell, and you are putting God inside the shell. Why don't you speak directly about the contemplation of the one for humanity? Saul, look, hey, not like that. Hey, how is it not? Of course it is. I know humanity. I am one of them. You are the one who didn't do it right. Every human is interested in coming directly to God. They aren't. Hey, they are. This wasn't going to end well, was it? How did it end? The two of them got into a canoe because Hay wanted to get to know humanity. Look, this is mythically disappointing. So off they went to Saul's island. When he got there, he looked like that, strange and wild. Saul started explaining to everyone, to his friend Solomon, introducing him to everyone, and Hay began to adapt and learn to speak the language better. When he learned to master it, to communicate well, all right, now I will begin my mission, a complete disaster. Saul says to him, there are all kinds of men, Hay, it's not going to work. But he insists, then let's go. Let's do it. Hay begins to speak to the people. Look, stop this. These divisions, this desire to keep everything for yourselves, it makes no sense. You need to contemplate unity. You need to be one. Separateness is an illusion. And people look at him. What are you talking about, my friend? Hey, look, this thing where you have one religion. He has one and you keep fighting each other. God is not two, God is one. This is not real. This is an illusion. The people, you are a heretic. And after a while, he said so many things that could not be spoken because they could not be heard. That people wanted to kill him. And people felt attacked. And it is interesting the way Ibn Tufayl presents this in the book. Because he invents by living through it, people feel attacked because they are not prepared to hear that. It hurts them, it wounds them. They need that layer of illusion. They are not able to have anything else. And at a certain moment he realizes that, even with the best of intentions, what he was doing was an act of violence. This realization comes after much suffering. He understands what he was doing was a form of violence. And human nature does not leap forward. No nature makes leaps. It is as if he tried to take a stone and throw it into space, expecting it to become a star. The steps must be climbed one by one. And everything has its own time. And when you take something away from a person, without being certain that they can receive something better, you leave them in emptiness. And that was a form of violence. He says, people are attacking me because I am attacking them. They do not understand. Everything has its own time. After some time, he comes to this conclusion. He gathers the people of that island and says, look, keep believing in what you believe. Continue with your faith, with your vision. Little by little, become more fraternal. But that's it. Be happy. And he leaves. At that moment, only he was wise. He leaves. That was not the time for anyone else to be there. The only person who was able to listen to him was Asal. And Asal didn't want to stay there, nor did he. The two of them left together, returning to his island. And then, back on his own island, he makes Asal his only disciple. And little by little, with great patience and over a long period of time, he teaches Asal the path that he himself had walked, of moving beyond separateness, beyond the forms of things, of the energy that gives life to all beings, this life that flows through all beings, this eternal fire that uses bodies as its tools, this continuous movement of the universe, which proves that eternity exists, the relationship between this external eternity and the internal eternity, giving to nature what belongs to nature, but giving to our soul what belongs to our soul, and, finally, perceiving unity. He guides us all in that direction, the path he had walked alone, and the two of them live happily ever after on that island, together with the wisdom they managed to attain through their own merit. And that is the little story. I will share with you a passage that is not at all uplifting, but it is inevitable to read, because this is what Hay says when he returns to his island. And he was still a bit bitter. He was not very resigned. He says this passage, pay close attention. It's a bit long, everyone, but it's worth it. Take a look. What could be more painful, more profoundly miserable, than the condition of a man such that, if we review his actions, from the moment he wakes up until the moment he falls asleep, we do not find a single deed that does not have as its aim one of these base and material things: accumulating wealth, seeking pleasure, satisfying a passion, quenching anger, acquiring a position that offers him security, performing a religious act of which he boasts, or that protects his own head. A citizen, from the moment he wakes up until he goes to sleep, does only these things. Material things that, to him, are profoundly inferior, or possessing things for his physical body, in the form of objects or pleasure, or possessing things for his name, in the form of vanity, glory, or prominence. He does not think of anything that belongs to unity. He only thinks in terms of separateness. He does not think of anything that transcends selfishness. He only reinforces his selfishness. In other words, an entire day without doing anything real. And the sum of many such days is an entire life, without doing anything dedicated to what is real, to the search for his own essence, as if it did not exist. An entire life spent pampering the body and letting the soul die of neglect. no nourishment for the soul at any moment of the day, and if you offer it, he does not know what it is for, as if he did not feel hunger. He says, "How is that possible? I never imagined this existed." But it is necessary for these people to live through this experience and to slowly become exhausted, so that at a certain moment they feel hunger. And when they are hungry, you can offer them nourishment. Before that, you can't. Unfortunately, I have sometimes shared with you that. On one occasion, people came to the philosopher Socrates. People were a bit upset with the politics of Greece, which was not going well. This is ancient. And they said, "If we take the politicians, the 30 tyrant, tie them to a chair here and have you speak to them for hours, Socrates, when we let them go, would they all become philosophers?" Then Socrates replied, "Look, my mother, Phaenarete, was a midwife, and she was an excellent midwife. But there is one thing she would never be able to do, to deliver a woman who was not pregnant." In other words, pregnancy, this germination within oneself, the need, the hunger of the soul, the need to discover a greater essence for life. That's something you must achieve yourself. A midwife cannot deliver something you have not conceived. In a certain way, the philosopher is someone who is pregnant in the soul, is nurturing a greater meaning in life than merely surviving. It is a curious thing because in a society where survival is still the main focus, and this is heavily reinforced by culture, this becomes exotic, this is strange. It is as if we are the ugly duckling. It is not about having vanity, nor any sense of superiority. It is a matter of respect. Respecir means to know how to see the needs of each person, but also to see our own needs and respect them. To look again, to know how to see. This is what Hay learned through great effort. To know how to see each person's needs and respect them, but also to respect his own. To understand that it is natural for a philosopher to need more than just survival, to need a greater meaning in life, and not to think that this is a punishment, that this is a nuisance, a discomfort. This is a gift, this is a pregnancy of the soul. To know how to value. Perhaps that moment when you threw in the towel and said, "This is not enough to fill my life." Perhaps that's one of the most sacred moments. It is the moment of exhaustion. A moment in which, per Plato's allegory of the cave, we begin to shift in our seats and to suspect that reality lies outside the cave. It is like that ugly duckling who, at a certain point, after seeing its reflection in water so many times, remember that water symbolizes the material world, distorted by the water, says, "I am a strange person, I am a peculiar being." But when he sees someone like himself, he discovers what he truly is: a swan. Fables too often carry behind them, at times, a philosophical message. If you find someone just as curious as you are, who also needs deeper explanations for life, you say, "Oh, I'm not the only one." If this is an affliction, it is both collective and contagious. Wonderful, there's others like me. That is why, throughout history, there have always been schools of philosophy, so that one person could support another in this need, which does not make anyone superior to others, but is simply a need like any other, and it must be respected. Those who have needed something more than merely surviving throughout history have been called philosophers. And what did Ibn Tufayl want to convey with this book? That this is a need that cannot be betrayed, and it is not a curse in a certain way. It is a sacred moment, one that we must learn to value. In other words, there is a certain dignity in valuing the so-called ugly ducklings, who are not so ugly after all, and in giving attention to this need, in respecting each person's need, and each person's moment. Does this exist in every human? Yes, it does, but it is not something that can be forced from the outside in. If this burns within you, if you feel this warmth, if this somehow makes you uncomfortable, look, discomfort is not necessarily a bad thing. In a society like ours, which worships pleasure, people think anything uncomfortable's bad and must be banished. Sometimes, discomfort is the best thing we have, because it gets us out of our chairs and makes us move forward. It is the discomfort in your tooth that makes you. Save it, otherwise you would lose it. It is a certain uneasiness that moves us to seek to discover who we are. And this restlessness of the soul that seeks answers is called philosophy. And what did Ibn Tufayl mean? Well, potentially it exists in all human beings, but it awakens in its own time and gradually comes to fruition. Do not consider this as a problem. Do not consider this a flaw. Do not see yourself as a stranger. You're a philosopher. Welcome to the island of Hay. Welcome. There are other needs, but they are also very beautiful and also necessary. Humanity needs some to be philosophers. One day, everyone will be, each in their own time, but some must legitimize this condition by being true to themselves. Well, this is our book. It concludes, then, with they lived happily ever after, on their island, Asal with Hay, as disciple and master. I am not sure if this was fully understood in that historical moment. It was taken as a fable, just as I was telling you that in Don Quixote. By Cervantes, he writes on the title page, "After darkness, I hope for light." He hoped to be understood one day, because in his historical moment, Don Quixote was considered a comedy. And, in truth, it is much more than that. The Self-Taught Philosopher, or the Living One, Son of the Watchful, which is its original name, may not have been fully understood by his contemporaries. But if you are searching for a greater meaning for your life, it makes perfect sense. This is philosophy. And that is it. I hope I have given you a reason for reflection and a reason for a certain healthy pride in who we are. Each one of us fulfills themselves in that moment of consciousness they are living through while seeking the next step. To those who love philosophy, congratulations. We are doing exactly that. We are philosophers, and that too is a reason for a healthy pride of the soul. I have presented to you the life of Ibn Tufayl. There is no precise date for when he wrote this work, but it seems to me that he lived in the 12th century. Here it is, 1105 to 1185. He felt that there was pressure from the Kalam, the theology of his time, to abolish philosophy, which is what ended up happening. 2 centuries later, there was no more Islamic philosophy. By the 14th century, it was gone. He feels this pressure to consider Hellenized philosophy, philosophy of Greek origin, influenced by Plato and Socrates, as something foreign, and he tries to make almost a manifesto to say that philosophy cannot be forbidden, philosophy cannot be banished from humanity. And that was his manifesto. Very useful and very relevant even today. Philosophy cannot be banished. It cannot be ignored. It is within us. It is part of human nature. I don't know why, because apparently Ibn Tufayl had no contact with the Indian tradition. But you know that many things came from the Far East, through that Silk Road that came from China. Alexander the Great even went as far as India. In other words, there was an exchange of influences there. It is even said that 1001 Nights itself is an Arabic copy of a work that is, in fact, Indian. Many of the fables that reached the Roman world are adaptations for the West of ancient Indian fables. Cicero says, for example, that Hercules is Balrama, the brother of Krishna, that the origin of the Hercules myth lies in an Indian tradition, and they are very similar. In short, there is an exchange of information there. There is a mutual influence. But I do not believe that Ibn Tufayl had any direct contact, perhaps with some Indian individual, but not with India itself. But this is already the 12th century, the 13th century, and soon after these philosophers lived, there was already a movement of people coming from the Far East.